The wagon wheels creaked against the rocky ground as Martha Henderson clutched her swollen belly. The pain had started 3 days ago, sharp and constant, making every bump in the trail feel like a knife cutting through her body. Her husband Thomas walked alongside their covered wagon, his weathered face showing the strain of their long journey west. "We need to stop soon," Martha called out weakly. "The babies are coming." Thomas looked around at the endless desert landscape. Red rocks stretched in every direction, with scattered sagebrush and stunted trees offering little shade. The nearest town was still 2 days away, and their small wagon train had been traveling for weeks without seeing another soul. "Just hold on a little longer." "Martha," Thomas said, though worry filled his voice, "we'll find a good place to make camp." Martha had married Thomas 3 years ago back in Missouri. She was just 19 then, full of dreams about their new life in California. Thomas had promised her fertile land, a house with a real wooden floor, and children who would grow up free on the frontier. The journey had been harder than either of them imagined. Their wagon train started with 12 families, but disease and accidents had scattered the group. Now only 3 wagons remained, and the other families were strangers who kept to themselves. Martha felt more alone than ever as another wave of pain crashed over her. The sun beat down mercilessly as they searched for shelter. Martha's dress was soaked with sweat, and she could barely sit upright. The babies inside her seemed to be fighting each other, pushing and kicking until she cried out. "There." Thomas pointed to a cluster of rocks that formed a small cave. "We can rest there until you feel better." The other wagons continued without them. The families barely looked back as Thomas helped Martha down from their wagon. She could walk only a few steps before collapsing to her knees. Thomas carried her the rest of the way to the rocky shelter. Inside the cave, Thomas spread out their blankets and tried to make Martha comfortable. But the pains were coming faster now, and Martha knew there was no stopping what was happening. She had helped deliver babies back home, and she recognized the signs. "Thomas, you need to help me," she gasped between contractions. "The babies are coming now." Thomas had never delivered a baby, let alone twins. His hands shook as he boiled water over a small fire and tore clean cloth into strips. Martha tried to guide him through what needed to be done, but the pain made it hard to think clearly. The first baby arrived as the sun was setting, a tiny girl who cried weakly in the desert air. Thomas wrapped her in a blanket and placed her beside Martha before the second baby began to arrive. This one was a boy, smaller than his sister and frighteningly quiet. "Why isn't he crying?" Martha whispered, her face pale from blood loss. Thomas rubbed the baby's back and cleared his mouth until finally a small cry emerged. Both babies were alive, but Martha was getting weaker by the minute. The bleeding wouldn't stop, and Thomas didn't know what to do. Through the night, Martha drifted in and out of consciousness. She tried to nurse the babies, but she was too weak to hold them properly. Thomas did his best to care for all 3 of them, but he was exhausted and scared. When morning came, Martha could barely open her eyes. The babies cried constantly, hungry and cold in the desert cave. Thomas knew they needed help, but he couldn't leave Martha and the babies alone to go find it. "You have to take the babies and go," Martha whispered. "Find someone to help them." "I'm not leaving you," Thomas said firmly. "We'll all go together when you're stronger." But Martha wasn't getting stronger. As the second day passed, she grew weaker and more pale. The babies cried from hunger, and Thomas had no milk to give them. He tried feeding them drops of water, but they needed more than he could provide. On the 3rd morning, Martha could no longer open her eyes. Her breathing was shallow and labored. Thomas knelt beside her, holding her hand and praying for a miracle. The babies lay quiet now, too weak to cry. Thomas made a desperate decision. He would have to leave Martha and try to reach the nearest settlement with the babies. It was their only chance of survival. He gathered supplies and prepared to harness their remaining horse to the wagon. As he loaded the wagon, Thomas heard the sound of approaching horses. His heart leaped with hope, thinking other settlers had found them. But when he looked up, he saw 3 Native American warriors riding toward their camp. Fear gripped Thomas as the warriors approached. He had heard terrible stories about Indian attacks on settlers. He grabbed his rifle and stood in front of the cave, trying to protect Martha and the babies. The lead warrior was tall and strong, with long black hair and painted symbols on his face. He raised his hand in what might have been a peaceful gesture, but Thomas was too frightened to lower his weapon. The warrior spoke in his own language, pointing toward the cave. Thomas didn't understand the words, but something in the man's tone seemed concerned rather than threatening. Still, Thomas kept his rifle ready. The warrior dismounted and walked slowly toward the cave. Thomas tried to block his path, but the warrior was much stronger and simply moved him aside without violence. When the warrior saw Martha lying unconscious with the 2 crying babies, his expression changed completely. He turned to Thomas and spoke in broken English. "Woman sick, baby's hungry. We help." Thomas didn't know whether to trust him, but Martha was dying and the babies wouldn't survive much longer without help. As the warrior knelt beside Martha and examined her condition, Thomas realized this might be their only chance for survival in the harsh desert. The warrior's name was Running Bear, and he belonged to the Lakota Sioux tribe. His weathered hands moved gently as he examined Martha, checking her pulse and looking at the blood-soaked blankets. He spoke quickly to his 2 companions in their native language, and one of them rode away at full speed. "My brother goes for medicine, woman," Running Bear explained to Thomas in his careful English. "She knows how to help." Thomas wanted to protest, but Martha was barely breathing and the babies were growing weaker by the hour. He had no choice but to trust these strangers who had appeared like spirits in the desert. Running Bear's remaining companion, a younger warrior named Swift Arrow, began gathering herbs from the desert plants around their camp. He crushed some leaves between stones and mixed them with water from their leather pouches. The mixture had a sharp green smell that filled the cave. "This helped stop bleeding," Running Bear said, showing Thomas the herbal mixture. "White woman lost much blood bringing babies to world." Thomas watched nervously as Running Bear lifted Martha's head and tried to get her to drink the medicine. Most of it ran down her chin, but some went down her throat. Her breathing seemed to become a little less labored, though she remained unconscious. While Running Bear tended to Martha, Swift Arrow turned his attention to the crying babies. Thomas was amazed to see the young warrior's gentle touch as he examined the tiny infants. Swift Arrow spoke softly to them in his own language, and somehow the babies seemed to calm down. "Babies need milk," Swift Arrow said. "Mother too weak to feed them." Thomas felt helpless again. He had been trying to give the babies water, but he knew that wasn't enough. They needed proper nourishment, and Martha couldn't provide it in her condition. Swift Arrow reached into his leather pouch and pulled out a small container made from animal hide. Inside was a thick, creamy liquid that smelled slightly sweet. "Buffalo milk," he explained. "Good for baby humans, too." Using his finger, Swift Arrow carefully fed drops of the buffalo milk to each baby. They eagerly sucked at his finger, getting their first real nourishment in days. Their crying stopped, and they seemed to gain strength almost immediately. Thomas couldn't believe what he was seeing. These warriors, whom he had feared just hours ago, were saving his family's lives with knowledge and supplies he never could have imagined. As the day wore on, Running Bear continued to care for Martha. He used different herbs to make poultices for her wounds, and he managed to get her to drink more of the medicinal tea. Her color began to improve slightly, though she remained unconscious. The warrior who had ridden away returned before sunset, bringing with him an elderly Native American woman. Her face was lined with age and wisdom, and she carried several leather bags filled with various medicines and tools. "This is Grandmother Willow," Running Bear told Thomas. "She has delivered many babies and saved many mothers. She will know what to do." Grandmother Willow knelt beside Martha and began her examination. Her hands moved with practiced skill as she checked Martha's condition. She spoke rapidly to Running Bear in Lakota, and Thomas could see concern in their expressions. Working through the night, Grandmother Willow used every skill she possessed to save Martha's life. She prepared different herbal teas, applied healing salves to Martha's wounds, and performed rituals that Thomas didn't understand but hoped would help. The babies slept peacefully after being fed more buffalo milk and wrapped in soft fur blankets that the warriors provided. Thomas marveled at how much better they looked already. Their skin had more color and they breathed easily. As dawn approached, Martha's eyes flickered open for the first time in 2 days. She looked confused and frightened when she saw the Native Americans around her, but Thomas quickly took her hand. "It's all right, Martha," he said softly. "They're helping us. They saved you and the babies." Martha tried to sit up, but Grandmother Willow gently pushed her back down. The old woman spoke in her own language, then Running Bear translated. "She says you must rest more. Your body fought hard battle to stay alive. The babies are well, but you need many days to heal. Martha looked around the cave and saw her babies sleeping peacefully in fur-lined baskets that the warriors had made. Tears filled her eyes as she realized how close they had all come to dying in the desert. "Thank you," she whispered to Running Bear and the others. "I don't know how to repay you." Running Bear smiled the first time Thomas had seen any emotion on the warrior's face. "Life is sacred gift. We help preserve life when we can. That is enough payment." Over the next several days, the small group worked together to help Martha recover her strength. Grandmother Willow stayed with them, preparing medicines and teaching Thomas how to care for his wife and babies properly. Swift Arrow taught Thomas which desert plants could provide water and nutrition in emergencies. He showed him how to find shade during the hottest parts of the day and how to protect a fire from desert winds. Running Bear shared stories of his own family while they waited for Martha to heal. He had children too, and he understood the fear Thomas had felt when faced with losing everything he loved. The babies thrived under the care of their unlikely guardians. The girl, whom Martha named Hope, grew stronger each day. The boy, called Samuel after Thomas's father, began to show more energy and curiosity about the world around him. But as Martha regained her strength, Thomas began to worry about what would happen next. The warriors had their own lives to return to, and the desert was still a dangerous place for a family traveling alone. Their wagon train had long since moved on, and they had no idea how to reach the nearest town safely. After a week in the desert cave, Martha was finally strong enough to sit up and hold her babies for extended periods. The color had returned to her cheeks, and she could eat the dried meat and healing soups that Grandmother Willow prepared. However, Thomas noticed that Running Bear and his companions seemed restless. "You need to return to your people," Thomas said to Running Bear one evening as they sat around the small fire. Running Bear nodded slowly. "My family waits for me. Hunting season comes soon, and my tribe needs me." He looked toward Martha and the babies. "But you cannot travel yet. Woman still weak. Babies too small for long journey." This was the problem that kept Thomas awake at night. They couldn't stay in the desert cave forever. But Martha wasn't ready for the difficult journey to the nearest settlement. Their supplies were running low, and winter would come eventually to the high desert. Grandmother Willow had been quietly listening to their conversation. She spoke to Running Bear and Lakota for several minutes, gesturing toward Martha and the babies. Running Bear's expression grew thoughtful as he listened. "Grandmother Willow has idea," Running Bear finally said. "She says you come with us to our village. Stay until spring comes. Then we help you reach your people's town." Thomas felt his heart race with uncertainty. He had grown to trust these warriors who had saved his family. But going to their village meant entering a completely different world. He had heard stories about settlers who disappeared into Indian territory and were never seen again. Martha had been listening from her bed of furs. "What choice do we have, Thomas?" she said quietly. "We'll die out here alone, and so will Hope and Samuel." Swift Arrow, who had been caring for the babies while the adults talked, looked up from where he was feeding Samuel drops of buffalo milk. "Our village is a good place," he said in his improving English. "Children safe there. Many mothers help care for babies." Thomas looked at his wife and children. Martha was right, they had no real choice. The desert would kill them if they tried to travel too soon, and they couldn't survive the winter in a cave. "How far is your village?" Thomas asked. 3 days' ride on horse," Running Bear replied. "But we go slow for women and babies. Maybe 5 days walking." That night, Thomas and Martha talked quietly while the babies slept between them. They had to make a decision that would change their lives forever. Going to the Sioux village meant trusting their survival to people they had been taught to fear. "I've watched them with our children," Martha whispered. "They care for Hope and Samuel like their own family. I think we'll be safe with them." The next morning, Thomas told Running Bear they would accept his offer. The warrior smiled and immediately began making preparations for the journey. Swift Arrow and the other warrior, whose name was Grey Wolf, started building a travois, a kind of sled that could be pulled by a horse to carry Martha and the babies comfortably. They used long wooden poles from Thomas's damaged wagon and stretched buffalo hide between them to create a soft bed. Grandmother Willow lined it with furs and created a small shelter to protect Martha and the babies from sun and wind. On the day of departure, Thomas felt nervous as he helped Martha onto the travois. She looked pale but determined as she settled in with Hope and Samuel. The babies seemed content in their fur-lined basket, unaware of the extraordinary journey they were about to begin. Running Bear led the way on his horse, while Swift Arrow and Grey Wolf walked alongside the travois. Thomas walked beside his family, carrying their few remaining possessions and his rifle. Grandmother Willow rode on another horse, watching over everyone like a protective mother. The journey through the desert was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. The warriors knew every water source, every shaded resting place, and every safe path through the rocky terrain. They traveled during the cooler hours of early morning and late afternoon, resting during the heat of the day. At night, they made camp in sheltered spots that provided protection from wind and curious animals. The warriors took turns standing guard while the others slept. Thomas was amazed by their knowledge of the land and their ability to find food and water in what seemed like empty desert. On the third day, they began to see signs of the approaching village. Smoke rose in the distance, and they encountered other tribal members who greeted Running Bear with obvious relief and joy. Word spread quickly that the missing warriors were returning with unusual guests. As they crested a hill, Thomas saw the Sioux village spread out in the valley below. Dozens of teepees were arranged in a large circle, with horses grazing nearby and children playing between the dwellings. Cooking fires sent thin streams of smoke into the clear air, and Thomas could hear voices and laughter carrying on the wind. "It's beautiful," Martha said softly, looking at the peaceful scene below them. But Thomas felt his stomach tighten with nervousness as he saw the people of the village gathering to watch their arrival. Men, women, and children emerged from the teepees, pointing and talking excitedly about the white family with the warriors. Running Bear rode ahead to speak with the crowd, explaining the situation in rapid Lakota. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could see the curiosity and concern on the faces around them. Some looked welcoming, but others seemed suspicious or worried about these strangers in their village. An elderly man with numerous feathers in his hair stepped forward. Thomas realized this must be the chief or an important leader. Running Bear dismounted and spoke with him at length, occasionally gesturing toward Martha and the babies. Grandmother Willow also joined the conversation, adding her voice to Running Bear's explanation. Thomas watched anxiously as the discussion continued, knowing that this moment would determine whether his family would find safety or face an uncertain fate. Finally, the elderly man approached the travois where Martha lay with the babies. He looked down at them for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he spoke in English, surprising Thomas with his clear pronunciation. "I am Chief Standing Eagle," he said. "Running Bear tells me you have traveled far and suffered much hardship. He says your woman nearly died bringing these children into the world." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, unsure of the proper way to address an Indian chief. "Your people saved our lives. We are grateful." Chief Standing Eagle nodded slowly. "Life is sacred to my people. When the Great Spirit sends children into the world, we must protect them." He looked at Hope and Samuel, who were sleeping peacefully in their basket. "These little ones will be welcome in our village." Chief Standing Eagle assigned Thomas and his family to a teepee near the center of the village. It belonged to an elderly widow named Morningstar, who had offered to share her home with the newcomers. She spoke no English, but her gentle manner and constant smile made Martha feel welcome immediately. The teepee was larger than Thomas had expected, with comfortable sleeping areas arranged around a central fire pit. Buffalo hides covered the ground and woven baskets held the family's few belongings. Morningstar had prepared a special area for the babies, creating a warm nest of soft furs where Hope and Samuel could sleep safely. The first few days in the village were overwhelming for Thomas and Martha. Everything was different from their life back in Missouri: the language, the food, the customs, and the daily routines. But the people were patient with them, especially with the babies who had quickly become the village's favorites. Children gathered around the teepee every morning, eager to see Hope and Samuel. The little girls would bring small gifts, pretty stones, wildflowers, or tiny beaded decorations they had made. The boys would stand shyly at a distance, but Thomas could see their curiosity about these pale babies who looked so different from their own children. Martha was still recovering from childbirth, so several village women took turns helping her care for the twins. They showed her how to prepare the buffalo milk that kept the babies healthy and growing. They taught her songs in their language that seemed to calm Hope and Samuel when they were fussy. One woman named Gentle Rain became particularly close to Martha. She had lost her own baby the previous winter and found comfort in caring for the twins. Despite not sharing a common language, The two mothers communicated through gestures, expressions, and the universal understanding that comes from caring for children. Thomas struggled more with adapting to village life. The men tried to include him in their daily activities, but he felt clumsy and ignorant compared to their skills. They could track animals across bare rock, start fires in strong wind, and navigate by stars he couldn't even identify. Running Bear took it upon himself to teach Thomas the basic skills he would need to survive in their world. Every morning they would go out together to practice hunting, tracking, and finding water sources. Thomas was a poor student at first, but Running Bear was patient. "White man thinks too much with head," Running Bear explained one day as Thomas failed again to follow a deer trail. "Need to think with heart and eyes and nose. Let the land speak to you." Gradually, Thomas began to understand what Running Bear meant. He learned to notice small signs he had missed before: broken twigs, disturbed earth, the way birds behaved when predators were near. It was like learning to read a book written in a language he had never known existed. The village followed the rhythm of the seasons and the needs of survival. Everyone had tasks that contributed to the community's well-being. The women prepared food, made clothing, and cared for children. The men hunted, protected the village, and maintained the horses. Even children had responsibilities appropriate to their age. As autumn approached, the entire village began preparing for the long winter ahead. Thomas and Martha learned to help with these preparations. Martha worked with the women to dry meat and prepare it for storage. She learned to tan hides and sew them into warm clothing, using techniques passed down through generations. Thomas joined the men on hunting expeditions, though he was still far from skilled. His presence was tolerated rather than valued, but he was learning. He also helped repair weapons and tools, using some of his knowledge from back home to contribute to the village's needs. The babies thrived in this environment. Hope began to smile and make happy sounds when people approached her. Samuel was more serious but equally healthy. Both children were growing rapidly, fed by buffalo milk and surrounded by more love and attention than most babies ever receive. As winter settled over the village, Thomas and Martha found themselves settling into a routine they never could have imagined. They had learned enough Lakota to communicate basic needs and ideas. They understood the village's customs and their place within the community. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were living in a temporary situation. When spring came, they would need to decide what to do next. They could try to reach California as originally planned, or they could return east to Missouri. Both options seemed impossibly difficult with two small babies. One evening, as snow began to fall outside their warm teepee, Chief Standing Eagle came to visit. He brought his pipe and settled by their fire for a serious conversation. "Winter will be hard this year," he said, looking at the babies sleeping peacefully in their fur nest. "Game is scarce and the snows come early. My people prepare for difficult times." Thomas felt worried about what this might mean for his family. Were they becoming a burden on the village during a time when resources would be limited? Chief Standing Eagle seemed to read his thoughts. "You wonder if you should leave before winter becomes worse. This would be foolish. Babies would not survive journey in snow and cold." Martha looked up from her mending. "We don't want to take food from your people when times are hard." The chief smiled. "You do not take. You give also. Your woman helps other mothers with sick children. Your man learns our ways and helps with work. Your babies bring joy to our people, especially to those who have lost their own children." He paused to smoke his pipe before continuing. "But I think you worry about what happens when spring comes. You think about your own people and the life you planned before the desert changed everything." Thomas nodded. This was exactly what kept him awake at night. "There is no hurry to decide," Chief Standing Eagle said. "Spring is many moons away. By then you will know in your hearts what path to choose. Perhaps you will want to continue to your white settlements. Perhaps you will choose to stay with us. Both paths have value." After the chief left, Thomas and Martha talked long into the night. They had been so focused on immediate survival that they hadn't considered the possibility of making a permanent life with the Sioux. But now, surrounded by the warmth of their teepee and the sounds of their sleeping children, the idea didn't seem impossible. They had found acceptance and kindness among people they had been taught to fear. Their children were healthy and loved. They had learned skills and wisdom they never would have gained in their old life, but they were still outsiders in many ways, and they wondered if that would ever truly change. Winter in the Sioux village was both harder and more beautiful than Thomas and Martha had expected. The snow fell deep and stayed on the ground for months, creating a white world that sparkled in the sunlight. The cold was intense, but the teepees were warm and comfortable with their central fires and thick buffalo hide walls. Food became scarce as the chief had predicted. Hunting parties returned empty-handed more often than not, and the stored meat and grain had to be carefully rationed. Thomas watched with admiration as the village shared what little they had, ensuring that children and elderly people ate before the adults. During the long winter nights, the village came alive with storytelling, songs, and ceremonies. Thomas and Martha were invited to participate in these gatherings, sitting around large fires while elders told ancient stories about their people's history and beliefs. Grandmother Willow often told stories specifically for Hope and Samuel, even though they were too young to understand. She said the baby's spirits would remember the stories and grow up connected to the wisdom of their people. This idea of their people struck Thomas deeply. The village had truly adopted his children as their own. Martha's health continued to improve throughout the winter. The other women taught her traditional healing methods and herbal medicines that she had never known existed. She became particularly skilled at caring for sick children and was often called to help when village children became ill. One night in the depths of winter, a terrible blizzard struck the village. The wind howled for 3 days and the snow piled so high that people couldn't leave their teepees. On the second day, they heard crying from a nearby teepee. A family's baby was sick with fever and couldn't breathe properly. Martha bundled herself in furs and fought her way through the storm to help. Using the healing techniques Grandmother Willow had taught her, she prepared steam treatments with medicinal herbs to help the baby breathe. She stayed with the family for 2 days, nursing the child back to health. When the storm finally passed, word of Martha's actions spread through the village. The baby's family came to thank her, bringing gifts and tears of gratitude. From that moment, Martha was no longer seen as an outsider being helped by the village. She was a valued member of the community who contributed her own skills and knowledge. Thomas also found his place during that long winter. His experience with metal tools and weapons from the outside world proved valuable when the village's equipment needed repair. He learned to work with the blacksmith tools they had acquired through trade, fixing broken knives, arrow points, and other essential items. More importantly, Thomas began to understand the complex social structure and decision-making processes of the village. He was invited to sit in on councils where important decisions were made, and his opinions were respected even though he was still learning their ways. As spring approached, Hope and Samuel celebrated their first birthday. The village marked the occasion with a special ceremony, giving both children traditional names alongside their English ones. Hope became Bright Star and Samuel became Strong Wind. Thomas and Martha were deeply moved by this honor. The babies were walking now and getting into everything with the curiosity of typical toddlers. They had learned to respond to both English and Lakota words, and they played happily with all the village children. To watch them, no one would guess they hadn't been born into this community. But spring also brought the question that Thomas and Martha had been avoiding all winter. What would they do now? The weather was warming, travel would soon be possible, and they needed to make a decision about their future. The choice became more complicated when a group of white traders arrived at the village in early spring. They brought news from the outside world and offers to escort any settlers back to white settlements for a fee. The leader of the traders, a gruff man named Jake Morrison, was shocked to find a white family living peacefully in the Sioux village. "You folks must be mighty eager to get back to civilization," he said to Thomas. Living with these Indians must have been a terrible ordeal. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest at the man's assumptions. "These people saved our lives and treated us better than our own wagon train did. We've been happy here." Morrison looked skeptical. "Well, maybe so, but you can't raise white children among savages. They need proper schooling and Christian teaching. You've got a responsibility to your own people." His words planted seeds of doubt in Thomas's mind. Were they being selfish by considering staying in the village? Did they owe their children the opportunity to grow up in white society, with access to formal education and the culture of their birth? Martha struggled with similar questions. She had grown to love many things about their life in the village: the sense of community, the respect for nature, the wisdom of the elders, and the way children were cherished by everyone. But she also wondered if Hope and Samuel would face discrimination or limitations if they grew up as outsiders in either. World Running Bear noticed Thomas's troubled mood and asked him to go for a walk along the river. As they sat on the bank watching the spring water flow past, Running Bear shared his own story. "When I was a young boy, white soldiers came to our village," he said quietly. "They took children to school far away to learn white ways. My younger brother was taken. We did not see him for 10 years. Thomas listened, understanding that Running Bear was sharing something deeply personal. "When my brother came back, he could not speak our language well. He had forgotten our ceremonies and stories. He was stranger in his own village, but white world never truly accepted him either. He lived between two worlds, belonging fully to neither." Running Bear picked up a stone and threw it into the water. "There is no easy path when people from different worlds come together. But I think love and acceptance matter more than what color skin someone has or what language they speak first." That evening, Thomas and Martha had a long conversation with Chief Standing Eagle about their dilemma. The chief listened patiently to their concerns about their children's future and their own conflicted feelings. "This choice cannot be made by others," the chief said finally. "You must listen to your hearts and decide what path will bring the most good to your family and to the world." He stood and walked to where Hope and Samuel were playing with some wooden toys that Swift Arrow had carved for them. "These children have been blessed with something rare. They have learned from birth that there are many ways to live in this world. Whether they grow up here or in white settlements, they will carry this wisdom with them. That is a gift that will serve them well no matter what path they choose." The spring trading season brought more visitors to the village, including some mixed families who had found ways to bridge the gap between white and Native American worlds. Thomas and Martha spoke with these families, learning about their experiences and the challenges they faced. One family particularly impressed them, a white man named Robert Creek who had married a Lakota woman named Dancing Elk 15 years earlier. Their children moved easily between both cultures, speaking multiple languages and understanding different ways of life. "The key is not choosing one world or the other," Robert explained to Thomas and Martha. "It's creating a new way that honors both traditions while building something unique for your family." Dancing Elk nodded in agreement. "Our children face difficulties sometimes, but they also have advantages. They understand different peoples and can help bring peace between them." As Thomas and Martha talked with more people and observed life in the village through the spring months, they began to see a possible path forward. They didn't have to make a permanent decision right now. They could stay in the village for another year or two, allowing Hope and Samuel to grow stronger before making any major changes. During this time, they could also work on a plan that might allow them to maintain connections to both worlds. The village was becoming more involved in trade with white settlements, and people like Thomas who understood both cultures were valuable as interpreters and negotiators. The decision crystallized one day in late spring when a group of soldiers arrived at the village. They had been sent to investigate reports of white hostages being held by the Sioux. The commanding officer, Major Williams, was surprised to find Thomas and Martha living freely and happily in the village. "You're free to leave with us immediately," Major Williams told them. "We can provide safe escort to the nearest fort, and from there you can continue on to California or return east as you choose." Thomas looked at Martha, then at their children playing nearby with their Sioux friends. Hope was chattering in a mixture of English and Lakota while Samuel carefully stacked wooden blocks that Running Bear had made for him. "Thank you for the offer, Major," Thomas said finally. "But we're not prisoners here. These people saved our lives and we've chosen to make this our home." Major Williams frowned. "You can't be serious. You're raising white children among savages. Think about their future. They need proper education and Christian upbringing." Martha stepped forward, her voice steady and strong. "Major, these savages, as you call them, have shown us more kindness and wisdom than we ever received from our own people. They saved my life and the lives of my children when we were left to die in the desert." She gestured toward the village around them. "My children are learning 2 languages. They're surrounded by people who love them, and they're growing up understanding that there are many good ways to live in this world." "How is that not a proper education?" Major Williams looked uncomfortable but pressed on. "What about when they're older? They'll need to find spouses, make livings for themselves. The white world won't accept them if they've been raised as Indians." Chief Standing Eagle, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, stepped forward. "Major Williams," he said in perfect English, "I spent 3 years in your schools when I was young. I learned to read your books and speak your language. But the most important lessons I learned came from my grandmother around the cooking fire and from my grandfather on hunting trips. The chief looked at Hope and Samuel, who had wandered over to listen to the adults talking. These children will learn both ways. When they are old enough, they can choose which path to follow, or they can make their own path that combines the best of both worlds. Major Williams spent 2 more days in the village, observing the family's life there. Thomas could see his surprise at how well integrated they had become and how happy and healthy the children appeared. When he prepared to leave, his attitude had softened considerably. "I still think you're making a mistake," he told Thomas privately, "but I can see your children are well cared for and you seem content. If you change your mind, there will always be help available if you want to return to white settlements." After the soldiers left, Thomas and Martha realized that they had publicly declared their choice to stay with the Sioux. It felt both frightening and liberating to have made such a clear commitment. Over the following months, they worked to make their integration into village life even more complete. Thomas became skilled enough as a hunter to contribute significantly to the village's food supply. Martha's reputation as a healer continued to grow, and she began training some of the younger women in techniques she had learned. The children flourished in this environment. Hope was fearless and outgoing, making friends with everyone she met. Samuel was quieter but equally content, showing particular interest in the stories the elders told and the crafts they practiced. By the time another winter arrived, the family had been with the Sioux for nearly 2 years. They had weathered difficulties together, food shortages, conflicts with other tribes, and the constant challenge of bridging 2 very different cultures. But they had also experienced joys they never could have imagined. They had learned that family could be defined by love and choice rather than just blood relationships. They had discovered strengths in themselves they didn't know existed. Most importantly, they had found a place where they belonged. One evening, as they sat around the fire in their teepee with Hope and Samuel playing at their feet, Martha reflected on how much their lives had changed since that desperate day in the desert cave. "Do you ever regret staying?" she asked Thomas. Thomas watched their children, who were now speaking Lakota as naturally as English and who considered themselves full members of the Sioux community. "Sometimes I wonder what might have been if we had continued to California," he admitted. "But I can't imagine a better life for our family than what we have here." Martha nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "When I think about that day when I was dying after giving birth, I never imagined it would lead to this. Running Bear and his people didn't just save our lives, they gave us a completely new way to live." As the years passed, Thomas and Martha's story became part of the village's oral history. They became examples of how people from different worlds could come together with mutual respect and create something beautiful. Hope and Samuel grew up fluent in both cultures, serving as bridges between the white and Native American communities. They helped negotiate trade agreements, served as interpreters during important meetings, and showed by their very existence that cooperation between different peoples was possible. The family never did make it to California, but they found something even more valuable in their adopted home. They discovered that home isn't about a place on a map or the color of the people around you. Home is where you find love, acceptance, and the opportunity to become the best version of yourself. Running Bear, who had saved them in the desert, became like a brother to Thomas. Grandmother Willow helped raise Hope and Samuel alongside her own grandchildren. The village that had welcomed them as desperate strangers had given them something precious, a true family and a meaningful place in the world. Years later, when white settlers and government officials came to negotiate with the tribe, they were often surprised to find Thomas and Martha Henderson serving as trusted advisors and interpreters. The family that had once been left to die in the desert had become instrumental in building understanding between 2 peoples who had often been enemies. Their story proved that sometimes the greatest disasters in our lives can lead to the greatest blessings, if we remain open to unexpected paths and trust in the kindness of strangers who might become family.